And today we want to share with you a bit on an example of trade unions transformation. We want to give you an idea of power resources in action and discuss with you what does this power resource approach have to offer for us. How can we use it in what we are about to undertake? And maybe also discuss, of course, the limitations that it has. So I invite you to listen the next 20 to 25 minutes to our colleague and comrade Eddie Webster of the University of Witwatersrand. I worked in Asia before. In Asia, they would call you an eminent person, but you are more than that. You're a passionate comrade, you're a labor analyst, you're a unionist at heart. And I have to say it was invaluable for us that you were on the steering committee of that project, Eddie. We have all benefited a lot from that, and I look up to you, Eddie, and I look forward to your intervention to take us on a bit of a story and bring the power resources approach closer to our colleagues. Thank you, Eddie.
I've been asked to give an example of how the power resources approach can be applied in Africa. And I'm going to start with a story about, it was a day a bit like today, hot, in a coastal town, about 1,000 kilometers down in the city of Durban. It was the height of apartheid, 45 years ago, January 1973. And at the time, Nelson Mandela, leader of the liberation South Africa, was still on Robben Island as a political prisoner. All our movements, political movements, were banned, were illegal. There were no trade unions. It was an authoritarian society. And as things would happen, a group of women and men in our large textile mills. At that time we had these large textile mills producing blankets and clothing. Massive one, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 workers. A group of them stopped work, folded their hands and stood next to the machine. And soon others did the same. And in a matter of minutes, the machines went silent. The factory came to a standstill. And they went out onto the street. And we have this thing we call the toy toy, and they danced in the streets. And they sang. Because workers in South Africa sing when they come together. And as they walked down the streets, they gathered more women and more men, until they had crowds of workers and all the mills came to a standstill. And a mass strike in the heart of repressive apartheid took place. Without any violence, without any physical abuse. And the employers were dumbfounded. And of course, they had only one option, and that was to talk to the workers. And it's that moment, let's call it a spontaneous mass action, because there were no organizations around. It was worker acting collectively together. An injury to one is an injury to all. Collective action And that's 1973. Strikes, as I've indicated on that PowerPoint. Of course, things had been happening in the political economy of South Africa. After the crushing of the popular movements, foreign capital flooded in. We had the fastest growing economy in the world based on cheap black labor. But in the process, a contradictory process, in building these mass factories and this cheap labor system, you created, for the first time in Africa, a large black proletariat. And that, of course, provided the basis for a new form of organization and a new form of action. Indeed, a new form of labor power. And that's what we see in 1973. Collective solidarity. Now, of course, a strike on its own is not a consolidation of power. And what a group of students, university lecturers, and others started to establish trade unions, sectorially based industrial unions, textile workers union, metal workers union, chemical workers union, starting off rather hesitantly with benefit societies, drawing on certain capabilities. The first was to start worker education, because what you had to capture first was what lessons can we draw from our history? What lessons can you draw from the past? And what we discovered when we started, and intellectuals like myself, privileged white background, stepped outside a classroom and started to listen to the workers. And what we discovered, of course, there was a history of struggle, of organization. There was a history there. So the first thing to do was to start drawing on your past and understand what lessons you can draw from that. You also had to build some kind of consensus, some kind of understanding, some kind of agreement amongst of what one is your strategy going to be, and to develop a autonomous agenda. And what we decided that was most sensible is focus on the factory level. Focus on the workplace. Build a cadre of shop stewards at the workplace who are clear, and as you don't confront management, you build up almost semi-underground, so you've got your members there. Somebody gets dismissed, abusive, racist supervisor, workers together, stop work, win back the person's job. And so you build up confidence in the organized, step by step, incrementally, factory by factory. And of course, the apartheid state was no silent actor. First, they banned, confined people to their homes, could no longer teach, work. Then they arrested, jailed. Of course, none of that worked, because these are ideas, and there's only one way to silence an intellectual: the bullet, assassination. And so you find a response on the part of the state to this movement, this emerging movement. But I think, importantly, the gains that are won on the shop floor and the organizations that they build needed to be consolidated. And so the pressure was put on the state to change the law, to allow, for the first time in history, black workers to be recognized, their trade unions, for the first time in history, black workers to be recognized. And in 1979, the Labour Relations Act was amended. Now, that, if you like, consolidated the gains. The state, Lucian, the state was crucial in legitimizing the demands of the workers, because on the basis of that law, on the basis of that amendment to the Act, the management could no longer say to the workers, we won't negotiate with you because you're illegal, because you are now legit, you are now legal. And so the trade unions expanded rapidly. But there was a problem. There was a problem because the unions had focused on the shop floor. They'd focused on the workplace, on building rights. And they were isolated from the broader struggle for democracy that is taking place in South Africa. But don't forget, South Africa has a deep history of struggle for democracy against racist minority rule, which goes back to 1912 under the African National Congress. So you had to find some kind of connection between these unions that were focusing quite narrowly on the shop floor, building up working class control of the factory, of their members and their organization. You had to broaden and form alliances, coalitions, and broaden the struggle. So what you see then is what we call stayaways. These are a kind of general strike where workers, not only in the factory but also in the townships, the students struggling after the Soweto uprisings of 1976, students, community activists, parents, part of a broad alliance of a popular group, popular struggle, and that, if you like, broadened it. Now, the story that I've told you, of course, is I've abbreviated it in many ways, but I want to stand back now and introduce you and see how power resources as a tool could be used to deepen our understanding of this narrative that I've given you. And the first is, of course, the strike is what we call structural power. The capacity, in a nutshell, to disrupt. The ability of labor to disrupt the economy. In the hard economy, may be through in the workplace, or it may be through your withdrawal of your skills, but that's what we call structural power. It's a core building block, and that's what laid the foundations for the building of this modern labor movement. And of course, the establishment of trade unions is what we call associational power. Consolidating, building organization that's sustainable over a period of time. In the case of these unions, there was a strong emphasis on accountability, of democracy, of worker control. And that's what we call associational power, and it's a key component of the power resources approach. And then, of course, there is the alliances is what we call societal power. The need for unions to go beyond the workplace, to make connections with other groups. I mean, it could be NGOs, it could be faith-based organizations, which is a very powerful factor in Africa. I always remember that. It struck me very powerful. Every meeting we had with the workers, we started with a prayer. What was said in that prayer, by the way, of course, was quite mysterious at times. It was, quite political, but nevertheless, there is the spiritual element to that. So I think that when you talk about societal power, you're talking about the need to engage with the public, with the broader society, to have coalitions, to have alliances with it. And then, of course, there is the Labour Relations Act institutional power. Institutional power in the power resources approach really is the law, the labour law, the institutions, the labour market institutions, the agreements that you enter into. These are all part of what we call the institutional power. So here you see, I mean, what I'm presenting to you is, if you like, an analytical framework that I think helps and deepens my understanding of the story I told you. The way in which power is used. Power, basically defined as the ability to get somebody to do something they wouldn't otherwise have done. I mean, there are very sophisticated books on it, but that's the definition I'm using. The ability to get somebody to do something they wouldn't otherwise have done. That's power, okay? Now, power is absolutely crucial to the building of the labor movement, and I think that this is what Mirko was referring to, the need to rediscover that central idea of labor power as your core building block for the labor movement. Now, I want to, because, of course, you know, in every house you have skeptics, and I want to raise 4 issues that, but by the way, if you want to get the really hard-hitting skeptic, you must look at the Global Labor Journal, volume 9, number 3, the current one, where this is described as the spectre of social democracy. But I don't want to get sidetracked on that. I want to give I think there are 4 issues that I think I wanted to raise with you. The first is, I think that these power resources here are no more or no less than power resources. They are potentialities. They are potentialities, because we can say here in Dar es Salaam, you've got public transport. It's almost entirely run by these buses. Dala drivers. They, of course, have the potential, I want to come back to that, the potential to bring the city to a standstill. But in order to do that, you need certain, what we're going to call capabilities. So in this approach, we talk not only about power resources, but also about capabilities. In other words, the ability to turn potential into actual, realizable power. And to identify those, because in fact, I already did in my story, but I'm now going to give it, because I mean, this is what we do in the university, give fancy names to ordinary common sense things, such as the ability to learn from your past. The ability to learn from your past it was crucial because mistakes were made by earlier attempts at organization. Mistakes were made, and so you start off by trying to learn from your past. And so a key capability in any attempt to rebuild the labor movement, I would argue, would be the learning capabilities. You could call it worker education, trade union education, but that's a fundamental part of rebuilding a movement, to learn your history, to rediscover. And secondly, I spoke about the need to resolve conflict and build consensus. Now, this is one hell of a difficult task, because you know, as you know, with trade unionists and left intellectuals, there are always lots of opinions and differences. And the difficulty of building a common position, how you do that. Can you do it in a participatory way, or do you resort to the classic Stalinist methods? But I think the ability to resolve conflict and prevent splits I mean, that's a key, and the that's what the list calls intermediation. Intermediation. In other words, the skill that has been demonstrated by the organizers of this conference to build consensus, to resolve differences, because there have got to be differences of opinion. You can't just take the comrade outside and shoot him. You've got to actually try and persuade him. So, I mean, that's a second crucial capability that took place. And I mean, I don't want to get sidetracked on that, but it was an intense ideological struggle over strategy. Do you focus on the shop floor, build your organization, or do you mobilize the community more broadly and confront the state? That was the debate, you know, and we argued, build your strength on the factory floor, and then step by step you build up and you confront. You don't take the state head on. If you do, you get crushed, because the powerful apartheid state was a vicious state. It was a vicious state. So the ability, the third one is the ability to develop new strategies and define an I think you have to have an autonomous agenda of your own. Agenda, in this case, worker control, shop floor, strong emphasis on shop stewards. You're building your own specific agenda in the process, and that's a third capability, what we call how to frame the framing of your struggle. How to frame it? Do you frame it? And so what we're doing is we're framing it. This may be a form of racial oppression, but your strongest weapon is your power in the economy. So that's a way of framing it, framing the struggle as one that focuses around building organization at the shop floor level. And then fourthly, I think you have to have the ability to adapt to changing conditions. And I think that's, again, where divisions open up, because at one moment the state is the enemy, boycott it, don't touch it. But then suddenly the state makes a concession and recognizes black workers. So what do? You stick to your position, boycott, or do you be flexibility and take advantage and register and try and move into the heart of the state, get inside its structures? So that requires what we could call organizational flexibility. So my first point then I wanted to suggest to you is that one mustn't see power resources simply as some kind of a formula that universally applies, that you actually have to understand it as a set of capabilities that you have to build up in any organization to realize that power. That there's nothing inevitable. It's not like the rising of the sun. It's something that has to actually be built step by step. And I think those are just four what we call capabilities that have to be developed. So what is the first issue I wanted to address? The second one is the in order, I think, to apply the power resources approach, you have to understand the context. And I think this has come through very clearly in this conference. The context, the specific context of Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, its political traditions, its political economy, and the way in which we have developed it through the Global Labour University, through a particular union program which we run mostly for African comrades, called Engage, and it's a great pleasure for me to have Warren here, because Warren drives us. I think give him a big hand here. He drives us. Basically, we bring 20 or so young trade unionists, or even mid-career, and for 2 months, and what we end up with is what we call a research skill in mapping. So we develop and we do an exercise in mapping where they actually conduct a survey. They have a questionnaire, they go out and find basic information about the workers' grievances, their sources of power, what organizations they belong to, and then on the basis of that, they go back at the end of the course, what we call transfer, and they transfer the skill back to their union in Ghana, in Kenya, and then they do the survey there, and on the basis of that, they build a plan of action. And essentially it's about recruitment. It's about trying to rebuild the recruitment, but it's doing it in a context where you are concretizing it in a specific, and you find out what organizations do, and you find it quite surprising that many of these informal workers actually belong to associations, what we call stokvel in South Africa. Stokvel. Help me, how do you define a stokvel? Rotating credit. You rotate credit. It's like a sort of savings scheme. So, but these are embryonic forms of organization amongst workers. So what you try to identify is what is the context, what's the demography, what's the sources of power, and on that basis you can then develop a plan of action. So I wanted to make my second issue here is the need to place it in a particular context, because there is some misleading, which actually that leads me to my third one. I'll call it the Uli position. The Uli's position is that South Africa is a special case. And my example here is not really relevant to the rest of Africa. Now, Uli's a highly intelligent and insightful man. So I think he's making a powerful point. And it's a question I want to leave with the House here. Is this something that is only usable, this analytical framework is only usable in countries that are democratic? And I want to just try and capture the point by pointing to a tension throughout this narrative I've given you over that 45-year period of the building of the South African labour movement. There was a tension. And the tension was really around to what extent do we work through the law and use the law, and to what extent, and try and institutionalize, and to what extent is it a struggle to smash the state, to overthrow the state? And you must be reminded of the fact that the liberation movement, the African National Congress, had embraced armed struggle, had embraced a violence as an instrument to do it. So you had a tension there about how do you actually deal in a society that's not democratic? How do you deal with it? And I think what happens is, what happened in South Africa is there are two sort of modes of engagement. You had people who were trying to struggle within the law to build up institutional power, and those who rejected that and thought that the only way to achieve liberation was to smash the state, to overthrow the state. So there was this tension, and what is interesting here is that these strategies of violence have re-emerged in South Africa now. It's interesting that because of people feeling that with the informalization of work, with the outsourcing of work, with the weakening of trade unions, and with the capture of certain state institutions by the predatory state, they've become frustrated, and so resort to violence. I'm a Barretta. Now we had a post office strike, and in order to get solidarity amongst the post office workers, tried to use a labour market system. We have a very elaborate mediation arbitration system. Got nowhere in getting permanent jobs in the post office. So what they did is form informal committees and started to go around beating up workers to get them to go out and strike. In other words, the re-emergence of violence. And I think that it's Maracana, the massacre of Maracana, where 33 mine workers were killed on strike by largely police action. And these are examples of the re-emergence of that more direct violent action. But I would categorize, I mean, it's interesting. But South Africa, it's an oxymoron, but I would call it a violent democracy. It's violent because there is this ongoing violence taking place, but it's nevertheless democratic because you have violent action, then you have a commission of inquiry, and then you have it out in the open, and so on. So I think there is, in that sense, Uli, I don't think South Africa is a special type. I think it's an African country that has gone through a very similar colonial experience, and we're on the edge of trying to consolidate and democracy. Maybe there are more democratic institutions. So I would wanted to on that third point to suggest I think that the power resources that I've indicated helped a useful way of understanding the building of the South African movement, I think can be applied across the African, with informal workers. I mean, an example is the Dala drivers here in Dar es Salaam, who built a union and called on the state to try and get licenses so they could consolidate their gains. I think power resources can be used, but it's got to be used in a particular context. And my final point is about institutional power. Now, it's very interesting here on these 4 sources of power. And initially, the power resources approach was built around structural power and institutional power. Interestingly, when it traveled across the Atlantic from North America to Europe, our colleagues in Germany added institutional power. It's interesting that it was out of German colleagues, University of Vienna, who developed institutional power as another source of power. I mean, the thing about institutional power is it's double-edged. It gives workers rights. It gives you the right to strike, for example. But it also lays down a set of procedures that you can only go on strike if you follow the following procedures, which allows, of course, employers to interdict that strike. Or alternatively, it gives opportunities, it creates institutions, tripartite institutions, the tripartite institutions that Lucian was critiquing on Tuesday. Those tripartite institutions, Lucian would argue, absorb and incorporate workers. And in that sense, you get a disconnection of workers' struggle from being absorbed into that institution. So I just wanted to conclude with that comment and to frame it institutional power as a double-edged sword. I mean, the thing about a double-edged sword, it can be used in both ways. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I have a comment regarding applying the power resource theory to the informal economy. And I would like to specify a little bit and then underline by doing so the importance of the trade unions. that I think power resources approach itself, yes, that can be applied to the informal economy, but I disagree with applying the power resources approach or theory of labor to the informal economy as the classical industrial relations with employee-employer relations, dependent employees in the informal economy are at least very difficult to identify, distinguish, etc. And so then my argument would be that that's an argument for trade unions to come in to be the vehicle to give at least associational institutional power for informal workers, and that's why I think we need to have this alliance or this support for the trade unions, or to open up to the informal economy and grant them this, or give them this access, because by them, the informal economy workers' organizations by themselves will not be able to have this kind of power.
So is your point of the crucial importance of the trade union as an institution? I think that the labour market in African countries is very fragmented. And I referred to it yesterday as not that we don't have a working class, you have classes of labor, different categories of labor, and you do have people in formal permanent jobs. You have a lot of people in casual employment, and you have a lot of people in self-employment. And you have a lot of people who are unemployed or have access to the land. Let's call them peasants. Those 5 different categories, I would argue, are very fluid in our cities. And people move in between them. They move in, and I think it makes organization very difficult. And my experience is that I think there are examples, and we identified them in the study. Say the border drivers in Kampala in Uganda, or the textile workers in Nigeria. Those unions have crossed the divide and started to organize, and I think that's very powerful because they bring resources to it. But I think that we ought to have we ought to, Annette, have accept a multiplicity of different approaches. I would say that the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung ought to think not only of working with trade unions, but I'm saying I think they are crucial, and maybe they're the most crucial actor, but they should also think of the self-organization. The most successful union of informal workers happen to be the Self-Employed Women's Association of India, is separate and organized of informal workers only on their own, not with the trade union. So I don't think one should only work with trade unions. I think one can find other associational forms. And sometimes those associational forms don't look like trade unions. And I think that's where you have to think of alliances. I found, the clothing workers in downtown Johannesburg, the only organization that they belong to are the churches or mosques. That's their faith-based organizations. And they're not just economic not just spiritual institutions. They also perform an economic and social function because they find them jobs, they find them housing, they even get them to help them take banking back to their villages. So I think one needs to be maybe recognize a sort of diversity of approaches to it. But I think that casual workers are the closest to easiest to organize because they are in some sort of an employment relationship. And so you can try and regularize the employment relationship. Kim.
Is this working? Okay. I suppose, Eddie, for me, part of the thing is what is the aim of the power? And I think the project that the power is meant to achieve has to inform what sort of institutional power and associational power one might want to build. So if you wanted to build a movement, say, based on shop steward cadres, an imaginative movement, a counter-hegemonic movement, it would suggest certain types of institutionalization are going to be a problem. And this is the thing about tripartism. And I think it was Carl van Holt who described the entry of union leaders into the state as gaining influence but losing power. And the problem is you often don't change the state, it often changes you. So the effect isn't simply that people get incorporated, but that a type of state logic goes into the unions, which might not be a bad thing if you want unions to be hierarchical and professionalized. So what I'm just saying is maybe the choices around which power we develop are partly a political choice that is informed by the project we aim to achieve. Likewise, with associational power, in the 1980s, a number of COSATU unions set up cooperatives, not to create jobs, and not, I'll give it to you now. Can you? Okay, not actually to create jobs. They were quite explicit, not to destroy capitalism, but to promote worker control and to show it's possible, even though those things lost money. So I think for me that's the thing. The last thing is I think not using the state and state institutions, we would have to differentiate between, for example, a strike that ends up in an industrial council or a much deeper immersion of the sort that would be involved in policy development through tripartism. I think those are a bit different, and the question would be how important is autonomy and the autonomy of the movement. I want to just relate it there that the choice in the 80s was, I think, sometimes simplified. You either build a strong union or you engage in a violent confrontation with the state. It doesn't have to be either or. Many stayaways were fairly peaceful, and many union workplaces brought to bear very peaceful power. And I think even for anarcho-syndicalism or any sort of movement like that, it can often be a very pragmatic, very patient movement, which is what I liked about this factory-by-factory approach of the 70s. Anyway.
Right, thanks, Lucien. I agree with you that, and maybe it is something that the House needs to reflect on here, using power resources for what purpose? I think that, and I think Mirko, we've actually left this hanging a bit on the assumption that we all know, what it is we're striving for. But in fact, we gathered here precisely because we are not sure anymore what it is we want. And we're shifting towards, say, this idea of sectorial bargaining. So, but I think the answer, in a way, Lucien, has been given in this conference, because this conference has suggested pathways. I think your point is, our point is validity, power for what? On the question of the state, it seems to me that I would distinguish between capital as an actor and the state, because the state is an institution that citizens are able to. And that's what democracy is. It's giving citizens the opportunity to shape that state. And the issue for me really is not the fact that the state can co-opt and incorporate. Obviously they can. This is a classic struggle in the history of the working class movement, the way in which and co-opted. It's a tension. It's between. And that's why I talked about the institutional power as a double-edged sword, because I think it can be used to co-opt it, and at the same time, it wins you rights, it establishes rights, it gains rights, it gives you resources. We would just have to, I think, Lucien, as we get older, let's just disagree on that point for the moment. Yeah, I'm not going to give any labels to your position. I'll just leave it and I'll let the House decide. Let the House decide. I mean, I suppose there is a fundamental point, really, that I don't. Anyway, okay, let me go down that path. I think, but I mean, the fundamental point really is where we find ourselves in strong agreement here, is the need for autonomous organisation and trade unions, and I think that's a stronger argument now than it was in the narrative that I was giving of the South African struggle, where COSATU aligned itself to the dominant national movement, and there were the Coast-Union Party alliances. I think that those days are over, even in South Africa, and I think that it's an argument where I think I would agree that the trade unions should certainly not form alliances with ruling parties. But I mean, Ghana's been doing this for I don't know how many years. They're not aligned politically, the trade union movement, but it doesn't mean they're not involved in politics. I think the key point is that the trade unions, of course, have to be involved in socio-economic issues, and they must change and lobby for political positions. But it doesn't mean you have to align yourself with a particular party. You will vote for the party that supports your program. And when they stop supporting your program, you cease to vote for them. You use your vote as a form of power. And I think that's what democracy is, and that's why I think the struggle for democracy is so important. And that's why I'm optimistic even about our violent democracy.
Yeah, thank you, Eddie. Because you mentioned my name, that's the reason why I'm sitting here. Otherwise, we find other platforms, but then I'll give you a chance as well. First of all, I think it's great that you mentioned the structural power, and I think we had at lunch a discussion that the word strike never came into this hall for the last 4 days or so. And that is, of course, a major power resource for trade unions. Strike, strike, strike. But I would like to point to 2 points. Well, one is a South African case, and then the other one is the institutional power, which goes much beyond, I think, just influencing or being part of a legal system, labor legislation, and so on. I told you that closer, yeah. I told you that I see this power resource approach in the context of the question of how democracy works inside a capitalist system, and that the power resource approach is only one explanation for the behavior of actors. And I would like to focus on institutional power and the question, the role unions play in political settlements, social contracts, pacts, policies, and so on. I understand the first part, labor's legislation, and I can see it from the 19th century when it was explicitly a tool to control workers. And it was established like that. And today we have even more instruments like that, like, for example, tripartite structures. I think somebody, maybe it was Lucien, talked about the role of the ILO in controlling I wouldn't say revolutionary, but control unions. And we shouldn't forget that there are many structures where we have that. And we have, I think, in this context of this political influence of unions based on their other resources and strength is problematic in the moment. There was, and I told you that as well, there was a debate recently in African affairs on the issue of political settlement and how complicated it is to drive for something new. That you have hundreds and thousands of actors, and feminism taught us that power is relational, and it's not only our power but the power of the others as well. So we have to consider that one. And then I come quickly to the role of the state, which is very important. It's not only the democratic dispensation which determines the space to use your power resources beyond, let us say, self-organization and factory mobilization. If we have that one, then we have this political settlement idea where you end up very often in a non-cooperative game in game theory, because you don't have an external enforcer in the form of the state. Because in many of the countries they are not only a little bit democratic maybe, or not even good enough democracies, they are totalitarian regimes. And they are brutal totalitarian regimes where you have no space. Under these conditions, you end up in non-cooperative game, where everybody is violating the rules of the games and the pact. And we have weak states. We have hard states, but we have weak states in this on this continent. And I can only see most of the countries, we just discovered in the break that Senegal is maybe not so bad, but most of the countries have really a major democracy problem, and I think this power resource approach is only of limited use. And for example, I propose that retraction and disengagement with state is maybe a better solution than building on your strength, but just to cut off all links to this totalitarian states. The last thing with South Africa, I talk about South Africa after '94, but even before it was a different situation because it was a colonial state, and the other colonial states was also racism, but this was brought then to perfection, the racism, but you had a rather big working class. And I think that's an important difference, let us say, to Malawi or so, or Benin, or whatsoever. And I think that makes, for me, a difference. And afterwards, we have the only democratic state on the continent. How much it has problems and so on, but I think South Africa is a special case, still for me. It was in the past, and it is today.
Look, I'll keep it very short, but I think I've been sitting here too long without telling anything. So, coming from this institutional one, I wanted us to go back a little bit to Annette's question about the informal movement and connect it to the structural power. Because what I found most interesting that in your example of the textile workers, you know, the maybe wild strike or spontaneous mass action, I think the structural power for the classical working class, a factory, it is quite clear. It's quite easy to grasp. You stop working, your company cannot produce, so that is power. That is very real power an individual can feel and share with his comrades in the factory. I think one of the issues of the informal sector in a lot of our countries nowadays is that while there are grievances in these kind of occupations, apart from a very few examples like transport, maybe some textile workers, some kind of formalizable industries, it's very hard for a person involved in this kind of trade to even realize a structural power. So I would say we would have to take if we take your framework, we would have to take a much closer look in how to build the consciousness for one's structural power in this environment, because I still think the framework works quite good, and then you can build up from there. But for us to even realize how to build a consciousness of a informal worker or much more a peasant, because you can go on strike obviously, but if you go on strike on a market, that might be less direct than going on a strike in a textile factory. So I would like to include that one when we are talking about informal economy these days.
Maybe let me just start with that last point. You know, I do think that I mean, at one level, it's an obvious point that South Africa is distinctive in as much as its level of industrialization was higher and therefore had a larger industrial working class. I mean, but I think we need to think a bit more flexibly about this, and I want to illustrate the point with the case of the most successful trade union in the largest trade union in India, which is the Self-Employed Women's Association. And I mean, it's interesting that what she did was take the concept of collective bargaining collective bargaining and apply it to women who worked from their homes and on the streets, and mobilized around them as a collectivity, and found a counterpart, maybe the local city council, for example, over the right to trade in the street. And on the basis of that, built up a powerful collective movement. And I think it's the idea of collective power that's the key point here. I don't think it's. I think we're missing something here. It's not. Of course, the factory is a simple way, but it's the collective idea. So what I mean, let me give you an example, because I spent time with these women in the countryside. One of their tactics, there was a middleman who was not being fair in the goods they were producing. So what did they do? They all came together, and they went to his house, and they sat down outside his house. And of course, the fool called the police. And when the police arrived, they said to the woman, "What's the problem?" They said, "Well, he's cheating us. He's a thief." And so they arrested him. And I think that you're using your collective power here. So I think that's the point. So unless we can find common ground on that point, I don't think we're going to take forward the idea of organ. Of course, consciousness. You're quite right. I mean, but that's what capabilities are. I mean, that's maybe another word. Capability. That's consciousness. Teaching, building. This is getting people's consciousness. I mean, maybe we should use that word rather than capability. This is a ridiculous word anyway. Consciousness. Okay. So maybe we should substitute that, call it consciousness, because I think but of course you have to, and Ella Batt, who founded the Self-Employed Women's Association, that was her big battle, to get the men in the trade unions to recognize that a woman who worked at home or worked on the street was a worker. That mind shift was absolutely crucial. So I think that I don't think we've begun to really make the mind shift we need in order to grapple with the so-called informal economy. On the question, Uli, I think I'm not going to. I want to pick up a distinction, because I think it's where I think I may find differences with some of my colleagues. I think the power resources approach identifies the union's power to do things, to disrupt the strike, which it's very good at doing, disrupt. But it doesn't have any power over. I think that's the problem. The trade, and a problem, Lucian, it's a problem about the trade union as an organization. I don't think the trade, and the result is the power resources tend to ignore capital as an actor. But I think it points to me, that the limits, I think, of if you took the narrative I gave this afternoon of the building of the labor movement, I mean, the ultimate, I think it points to limits in their power. Power to, but not power over other classes. But I mean, that's, obviously upward. I mean, just one other point about the law. I mean, I think that the strongest, the example I would give, where by changing the law, the unions, black workers got recognition, legitimized their demands, was a fundamentally important right. I mean, that's why we argue for worker rights. That's why worker rights is at the center of the labor movement. It's demands to get rights. But rights mean nothing if they're not enforced by the law. And who enforces the law? It's the state. Yeah, it's supposed to do. So what you need is not to abandon the state, Lucian. Make it accountable. That's the point. Make the state accountable. Democratize the state. That's the. Okay, let me leave it at that. Yeah.
I'm following so much the discussion that I nearly forgot what I wanted to say. Strikes generate unions. I think this is historically the truth. But unions many times do not generate strikes. it's not surprising that it's German scholars who added the institutional thing to the power approach. I am from the IG Metall, don't kick me out, but our strike statistics in Germany are certainly not good. And one has to go back to 1916, when we had the first form of corporatism, when the unions accepted a deal. Do not strike, and for that we're going to increase the minimum wage with the Kaiserreich. And it was in 1919 that the unions were donated from the employers the right for collective bargaining in order to not join the revolution. There are other cases in Germany. So we have to understand that it's not always the logic that from a strike a union is generated using the associational power to really forward it. Now, I have worked in the last 10 years in Asia, in China, and recently in Russia. And coming from there and looking at Eastern Europe, we have another dynamic. What we have in the transition from the command economy to the market economy is that the union transitioned with the economy. But up to now, they got somehow stuck through tripartite deals with the state. And what we now see is in China, in Vietnam, in Russia, in other countries, we have strikes. But strikes and unions are disconnected. And currently they remain disconnected because the state, even in semi-authoritarian state, this is what I would call Russia, is mastering the control of trade unions, and the trade unions, they are not engaging in strike activities. So I take this power resource approach as a wonderful analytical tool, but it does not help me too much in order to understand certain dynamics in certain countries. And I see a tendency globally for labor that collective action is more and more disconnected from trade unions. And this is something which partly exists in Africa as well. I have witnessed so many strikes in Africa, which were wildcat strikes, generated spontaneously, and thereafter the unions went to the strikers and asked, can we please bargain on your behalf that we return it? So not the unions as an associative power to enforce the conflict, but a kind of only negotiating without using the structural power.
Yep, the first one is a comment to Comrade Daniel. I mean, it's clear that vast majority of workers in the informal sector that they lack structural power. I got the honor, or I have the honor that I'm part of the Trade Union and Transformation project. But one key finding of the project is, especially with regards to that lack of structural power for many workers in the informal economy, is that it can't be substituted with this lack of structural power, but it can be compensated by associational power or by societal power. So it's clear that they lack structural power, but one of the key findings of our project, of the project, is that this can be compensated, not only in theory, but especially in reality by associational power and societal power. This is actually the first time, Eddie, that I share a fishbowl with you. Although I spent actually quite a lot of time with you, and I would like to make use of your presence here. I mean, you always say you're now a pensioner, and now the FES is exploiting you. That tells us a lot of your structural power. But since you're with us since yesterday, you heard us talking about pressure from below, and that we want to play a role in building pressure from below. But there's the big question of how. How can we do that? You talked briefly about the Global Labor University, where you are further exploited by FES since you're a teacher. at the Global Labor University and especially the Engage program. And you briefly talked about engage and transfer and mapping, and that at the end of the day, the participants and their unions coming up with action plans for recruiting. So this is what you briefly talked about. But I would like to ask you to give us a bit more of your opinion about how can the power resources approach help with that? How does it help the participant, the GLUE Engage alumni, to finally recruit more workers? How does it help the Engage participant to build a stronger union? And how does it ultimately also might help the FES to build pressure from below? Or maybe put it very simply, how can we turn the resources approach, a very theoretical approach, into an organizing tool?
Okay, let me just pick up on Rudolf's point. But I mean, it's interesting. I think increasingly, because of the disconnect between ordinary workers and their leaders, putting it simply, increasingly strikes are taking place outside of the leadership or control of the union. I mean, the classic example is the Marikana massacre in platinum mines in South Africa in August 2012. That wasn't, the trade union didn't lead that. It was rank and file worker committees, not part of the trade union at all. In fact, it was against the trade union, the National Union of Mine Workers. And I think that's a global trend. I think it's, I would argue, it's to do with the lack of trade union democracy. I mean, that's the, I think the unions are not responding to their members' needs. That's why. You don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater because, the trade union is not functioning properly. They make the trade union more democratic. It's an internal democracy question. On the questions of pressure from below, I think there are a lot of colleagues from the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung here who run programs and are thinking, does this have any relevance to me in my area? That's the kind of, I would encourage people to be a bit adventurous, and take a few risks. And the way that we have used it, and I think Warren ought to speak really. I mean, he's the guy who does not. I'm just the old man. He does the work. But basically, I think the way to build it up from below would be to start with workers' education. That would be my advice to the House. I think you need to start as well. I mean, I'm drawing my own experience here from when it's a long time ago now. It's 45 years ago. But we started with just basically teaching education. What I'm saying here, I'm saying that I think the way to start is to introduce trade union education, or much broader than worker education, where you deal with things like history and the whole question of consciousness, and there's a rich history of labor struggles in Africa. There's a rich history here in Dar es Salaam, in this city here, and so I think that worker education would be the sort of opening up, and that I think, Bastian, would be from below, because you deal with ordinary working workers and officials, and you introduce the mapping, and so they would go out. I mean, the way we do the mapping is that you find workers, and they have a questionnaire. They interview 5 workers, and you build up a database. You build up information, and on that you develop a plan of action. And the plan of action provides you with a strategy to recruit, and that's how I would do it from below. I don't think you can do that from the FES office. I think you're going to go through extraordinary existential angst if you try to think, that's what you have to do. Yeah? I think what you have to do is identify potential partners out there. And that's where, Annette, I think the trade union is the obvious one. But the problem with these trade unions, many of them are not trade unions. in any serious sense of the word. So you've got to find, I think, the right people. That's how I would do it. And then they do the workers do the survey. I mean, it's not rocket science. I mean, I want to tell you, we're dealing with guys who don't have university degrees or anything. They're perfectly capable of conducting a questionnaire. And, we'll... in fact, yeah, maybe we should run these things in these different countries, Warren, or you should.
I think what is important is how the approach is instrumentalized. Obviously, this must speak to local conditions and contexts, but not only is it how the approach is contextualized and instrumentalized, but also I would argue that this instrumentalization must be linked to a particular goal, medium and long-term goal that is developed or should be developed by those who are using this particular approach. Now, on a back again, I guess, to the abstract. If we're looking at, let's say, for example, structural power, and let's relate this to the informal economy, I don't know. I'm not so sure if informal economy workers are lacking structural power as has been written about and has been discussed as much. In that, for one, different workers have different kinds of structural power. In the discussion about, or in the conceptualization of structural power, you have market-based bargaining power, which is linked to skills. So thus, obviously, a pilot has greater structural marketplace bargaining power than, let's say, an ordinary mine worker. But a workplace bargaining power is another source of structural power as well that must be considered when one talks about structural power. And I guess the idea that the informal economy workers lack the structural power, again, this must start from how do you define informal worker? I've been involved in the Engage program for quite a number of years now, and each year there is a new definition of informal that is presented to our participants in the program. So this shows, number one, that I don't think it's fully conceptualized as yet. So I think I do think we need to be a bit cautious as to our determinations of what kinds of power informal workers do have. On the other hand, they may not have a standard or typical employee-employee relation, yet a lot of what informal workers do struggle for does translate, or at least is quite similar to what many other workers in the more formal sectors do. These could be working conditions, etc. And they may not have your classical employer, but they do engage local state officials in much the same way that workers in the formal sector do. So again, I think we need to be a bit cautious when we are defining the capabilities, or at least the power of informal workers. Last point, I think again on the issue of institutional power, because I think we seem to be in all agreement, or at least the other forms of power, societal and associational, seem to be a lot less contentious. So on the issue of institutional power, I think, first of all, based on the idea that was mentioned earlier about, distance to or closeness to the state, I don't think the state can be democratized. I think the very notion of state power, which is centralized authority, fundamentally in the hands of very, very few people, that gives them the power to make decisions on behalf of millions of people in one particular meeting, I don't think is a kind of democratic process that I would encourage. It's the form of democracy that is linked to state governance. Representative democracy is in and of itself a dereliction of political duty, in that those who choose to vote and those who are regarded as citizens are fundamentally giving their ability to make choices and to implement choices and to benefit from those choices away to representatives. Now, the attitude towards the state, any particular attitude,
whether it be Comrade Lucian's or Professor Eddie's, these are ideological choices. The idea that the state is a neutral actor, this is an ideological point. I don't think it's a natural point. Now, your analysis then of the state determines your attitude towards institutional power. Of course, and absolutely, it is better for the majority of African people to live in South Africa, to live in the current dispensation than during the apartheid era. However, what we should, I think, be careful of is to think of institutional power, or at least I would argue that we should think of institutional power as the development of institutional power, but without institutionalizing trade unions and trade unionism. So thus, when I think what we should be careful of is trying to develop institutionalized entities as the end goal of struggle. And despite the fact that tripartism over the last 50 years in many countries around the world has seen real gains for workers, I think what it has fundamentally done is also through the processes of institutionalization, it has been a fundamental dead end for the ability of workers to respond to changing environments, both political and economic, in a neoliberalizing world, in a world that is globalizing. What for national tripartism if local and international multinational corporations can completely ignore them?
Manfred, you have the penultimate contribution to make.
Well, it is a question, but I will be very, very brief. Use, of course, the opportunity to thank you for being with us at this conference. Thanks so much on behalf of FAS. My question is, because I'm usually a bit a slow thinker, but now we have these pathways, and one involves multinationals very much. And maybe you can just briefly help us, just as a very brief impulse, you know. We have a power resource approach. We have to find good strategies. And of course we have some, you know, like framework agreements, some strategies we do. They have a particular reasoning. But we have now not just some multis. We have a massive inflow of capital, FDI, Anglo-Saxon FDI, from China. It's not only Volkswagen. So my point is, you know, whether we have maybe to, well, following power resource, maybe there are better or new ideas. Maybe we have to be more, we have to differentiate more. I don't think we have yet a proper answer on this massive capital inflow and using power resource. Maybe, do you have some suggestion how to go about it?
Right, I mean, just on the, I see multinationals as possible opportunities, not just as constraints. I think, if I could go back to my story of Durban and building the first factories we targeted were the British multinationals. Why? Because there's an anti-apartheid movement. There was a body of people in the UK that one could link up with, because they have organized workers there. And so the moment, you know, you give them a phone and say, look, you're trying to organize workers down in Durban, why don't you guys put pressure on your head office back home and help us get an agreement? But it was the first agreement. I mean, it was, so that there isn't, I think one should see multinationals as a possible opportunity. But I think it raises the China question, because you don't have, as we've gone on about in this conference, the kind of democratic civil society that you have in Britain or in Germany. The distinction I would draw, and I think it's a strategically important one, is between, to distinguish between private Chinese capital and state capital. I think Chinese state capital research has shown, for example, in the mining industry, in the copper belt, were much more concerned with long-term objectives than the private companies, because they weren't driven by quarterly reports. A private company has to deliver short-term to the shareholders. And so when you have a downturn in the price of copper, you lay off workers. But the state company had a long term and didn't see copper only as a form of exchange, but also saw it as a use value, if I may use those distinctions. And the result is that they wanted to keep the mine open because they had a long-term interest in building copper industry in China for their own industry. So they didn't lay off workers. I mean, I'm just making a simple example. That had the accumulation strategy was different. It was the private was short-term, the state was more long-term. I'm not saying they weren't both concerned with profit, but I think there are varieties of capital, not just varieties of capitalism, varieties of capital. And I think that's smart. And I think I think the power resources doesn't really explore this. I mean, this is not some kind of biblical text that are being passed on to the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. That's come from commandments that we're putting forward here. I mean, these are the it's a tool that you can start to think about of how to begin to organize and recruit. I mean, it's a dynamic thing, and one of the areas I'm saying to you, I think it doesn't really address the question of capital. It's about organizing workers, but what about capital? So I think use your we call it COP, your brain to identify what capital is doing. So I think we should think about multinationals as opportunities. Just to pointing, Warren, I think when we won democracy in South Africa in 1994, we had a big, in the trade union, a big debate, because people said, we have a form of direct democracy we've built on the factory floor, because shop stewards are directly accountable to their members. Once we introduce parliamentary democracy, these guys are going to go off to Cape Town, 1,000 kilometers away, and they're no longer with you side by side. And how are we going to make them accountable? That became the question, because not the shop steward. But basically, the shop steward is a form of direct democracy. I think having somebody represent you doesn't cease to make it democratic if you have mechanisms of accountability in it. So otherwise, the only way you can think about democracy is at the factory level, small. And I think that would be quite narrowing. The other, there is a German. I have to. This is after all. These are the sponsors. There's a German social scientist of 100 years ago by the name of Robert Michel, and he introduced this concept. He who says organization says oligarchy. And he said it's an iron law. Whenever you have organizations, you're going to get monopoly by a few. That, Warren, I think is fundamentally wrong. It's not a law. It's a tendency. A tendency. When the sun will rise in the east, that's a law. The fact that organizations are controlled by an oligarchy is a tendency, and there are counter tendencies to every tendency. The counter tendency is that rank and file workers will organize and challenge you. If you abuse your power, they'll challenge you. So it's a fundamentally wrong argument of Michel to see it as a law. It's a tendency, and I think the point is you have to constantly struggle for democracy. Thank you.